dying and rising gods served sociological functions in ancient communities as well, and they did so primarily in two different ways. The first way was that they taught that ancient people's sacrifice was necessary for the continuity of the community. And this is most clearly evident when we think about preparing people to go to war on behalf of the polis or the clan. The ancient Norse, the ancient Greek, these communities centered around war, and they needed to be able to persuade young people to be willing to give up their lives for the sake of the community. And so they did that by essentially using these stories to help people understand that if they died, they would remain a part of the community through legend and reputation. They'd earn glory and honor. But the stories reinforced over and over that those sacrifices were necessary and that people before you had made them and people after you would make them, and that this was a defining part of your community. But you didn't necessarily have to be prepared to sacrifice your life. These stories are metaphors, after all, and death is a metaphor for change or transformation, and so, or the loss of something. And so these myths taught, for example, women that their giving up their freedom and comfort and convenience was necessary because they had to become mothers and they had to be willing to endure childbirth, and they had to do it over and over because women were expected to provide children to their families and to society. And pregnancy and childbirth are painful, and they come with risks, especially in the ancient world. And so where men might have to go to war, women had to be prepared to give birth. In both cases, sacrifices were necessary. Maybe you'd have to die, but certainly you'd have to give up some other kind of freedom. Maybe you don't want to go to war. Maybe you're afraid to go to war. Maybe you don't want to become a mother. Maybe you understand that by becoming a mother, you give up your convenience. You give up your comfort. You've got to dedicate yourself to the care of other people. Ancient communities privileged the community over the individual, and so all people had to be prepared to make small sacrifices too. They might have to be prepared to give of their time to a king. They had to share the fruits of their labors with the gods. They had to serve the community, and they didn't always get to do what they wanted or when they wanted. For example, children had no choice in professions. They had to do what their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents had done. So if you were born into a shoemaker's family or a potter's family, you didn't get to go and be something else. You had to do what was traditional in your family because it's what society and your family expected of you. And that means you have to sacrifice your own personal desires and dreams. And that's hard. And so these stories were told over and over and over to help reinforce the idea that the community is more important than you are. And we live in a very individualistic society, so these stories are harder for us to understand. Maybe we need to hear these lessons more than ever. Ancient dying and rising gods served a second sort of purpose, and that is to say that they are often about something that is necessary, something that dies, that death is necessary in order to help a community return to normal. So one way to think about this metaphorically has to do with regime change. The old leader dies and a new leader has to take their place. And that means that communities have to be bigger than the people who lead them so that they can survive from one regime to the next, from one king to the next. Ancient China is a really great example of this. There was dynastic change throughout the history of the ancient Chinese Empire. And it was understood through myths that China would continue, the civilization would continue, even with the rise and fall of different dynasties. King Hamlet from Shakespeare is a really great example of that idea, that you can't have a new king without the old king passing on, and that every single time that happens, death only ever leads to the next chapter. Sociologically speaking, these myths were really, really important because they reminded people of the bonds that they had in their larger communities. When we look at modern myths like the Hunger Games, we can understand how this might work. In the Hunger Games, for example, Katniss is in the games, and one of her opponents is a young girl named Rue, who comes from a different district. And in the story, Rue dies, and she literally becomes a dying, rising god. I had such a fun time watching this movie. My family really thought I was crazy because I gasped when I realized exactly what was happening. Rue not only dies, but then Katniss lays her body out on the ground, covers her with flowers, and then she literally rises, thanks to a helicopter, into the sky. It's just so wild that she fits this category. But what does her death mean symbolically? Well, Rue's death helps Katniss to live literally, and it helps her district to continue to participate in the Hunger Games through Katniss. But symbolically, this means that we have to be willing to let one part of society go for the rest of society to continue. So Rue's death could be understood, for example, as letting a bad law die, or a tradition that we think is important but needs to go away. And society has to be able to reinvent itself over and over, and these reinventions are often really difficult. For example, the United States in the 19th century had to be willing to end the practice of enslaving other human beings. Slavery was the law of the land up until the mid-19th century, and that law had to go away. That whole way that the United States understood itself as a nation founded on and dependent economically on the practice of slavery had to die and be reborn. And so in a way, the scene from the Hunger Games can be understood to be a metaphor of maybe the Civil War and America's reinvention of itself afterward, or any kind of transformation in society that is difficult and painful, but also inevitable and necessary. We see that with Obi-Wan Kenobi and his death in Star Wars as well. Obi-Wan Kenobi is one of the last of the remaining Jedi, and his death signals a kind of death of an old order, an old way of doing things, of thinking about things. And so another way to think about this metaphorically is the idea that an old generation dies and a new generation takes its place. You see that with Luke, who represents this new generation. And this might be a metaphor, again, for the United States, the way in which generations transform society. They imprint society in their own image, and then when their time is done, a new generation rises and imprints its own image on society as well. So, as you can see, dying and rising god myths have to be understood as metaphors. And I've explained that in this last slide, how these stories might work metaphorically. Make sure as you're thinking about these that you can connect them with specific ancient societies as well. And if you choose to analyze a dying and rising god myth, make sure that you can understand how the people who created that myth would have seen it. How, for example, the ancient Greeks would have understood from their perspective the story of Persephone or of Adonis. How the ancient Kikuyu would have seen the myth of Wanjiru. In this last bit of the lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about two specific myths, Wanjiru and Persephone.